Since I was little, my family has always been very close. Uncles, cousins, we all lived in the same city and often got together for lunches and celebrations. Sunday afternoons were always lively, full of laughter, conversations, and that delicious smell of homemade food that my grandmother prepared with so much love. Children played in the backyard, while adults sat around the table, sharing stories and catching up on each other's lives. Among all my uncles, there was one in particular who always had a special place in my heart, Uncle Joao. He was my mother's younger brother, and as long as I can remember, he was always affectionate and attentive to me. When I was little, he carried me on his shoulders, pretending I was a princess on a magical horse. He gave me advice, helped me with my homework, and always knew how to make me smile, even on the hardest days. Joao was a charming man with an easy smile and a contagious laugh. He had a special way of making everyone around him feel important and loved. At family lunches, he would always ask me questions about school, my friends, and my dreams for the future. He was the kind of uncle who never missed one of my school performances, always in the front row, applauding louder than anyone else. As I grew older, our bond remained strong. Even as a teenager, when I started to seek more independence and move away from family gatherings, he always found a way to stay close. He would take me for rides in the car just to talk and give me advice about life. Joao had a unique ability to make me feel understood and valued, even when I was going through difficult times. I remember once, when I was 17, I was facing a huge disappointment in love. Uncle Joao showed up at the house unannounced, took me for a walk, and bought me ice cream. He heard me cry, offered words of comfort, and reminded me that I was strong and deserved someone who truly valued me. That day, he was more than an uncle. He was a true friend. Over time, he continued to be a constant, comforting presence in my life. When I got to college, he helped me move into the dorm and gave me a big hug, telling me he was proud of me. He always encouraged me to follow my dreams and to never give up, no matter how difficult things might seem. We were so close that I could never imagine that anything could change this relationship. Joao was like a second father to me, someone I trusted blindly and turned to for support and guidance. Our relationship was, for all intents and purposes, perfect, until that fateful day when everything changed. One day, when I was 25, Joao invited me for a car ride. It was a sunny Saturday, and I was at home, resting after a busy week at work. I received a call from my uncle, and he, with his always cheerful tone, suggested that we go for a walk. I recently bought a rural property, and I wanted you to see it. It's a beautiful place. You'll love it, he said. The idea of a walk in the countryside seemed perfect. It had been a while since we spent time together, just the two of us, and I was curious to see Joao's new acquisition. Without hesitation, I accepted the invitation. He arrived home about an hour later, his new car shining in the afternoon sun. I felt a rush of excitement as I got into the car, remembering all the times he took me for a ride when I was a kid. During the trip, we talked about different topics. He asked me about my job, my friends, and how I was dealing with adulthood. Joao always had a way of making me feel at ease, and our conversations flowed naturally. We talk about our childhood memories, the jokes at family lunches, and even the difficult times we faced together. The road to the property was surrounded by green trees and open fields, providing a serene and beautiful landscape. Joao started telling me about the plans he had for the property. He wanted to transform it into a refuge, a place where the family could gather, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. "I'm thinking about building a house here with a big garden and maybe even a small lake," he said, his face lighting up with excitement. After about an hour of travel, Joao made a turn on a dirt road that led to a more isolated location. The view was stunning. Gentle hills stretched as far as the eye could see, and the fresh air was invigorating. He parked the car and suggested that we go out for a walk and enjoy the scenery. As we walked, he continued to talk about his plans, but there was something in his tone that seemed different. Suddenly he stopped and looked at me in a way he had never done before. His eyes were filled with an intensity that left me disconcerted. He came closer, and before I could process what was happening, I felt his lips touch mine. The kiss was unexpected and overwhelming. There was a fire in her eyes, something she had never seen before. My body reacted before my mind could comprehend. For a moment, I stood frozen, feeling a mixture of surprise and confusion. Part of me wanted to push him away, but another part was intrigued and curious. The touch of his hands on my back sent waves of heat through my body, and I felt my heart beat faster. However, reality quickly returned. I turned away from him, trying to process what had just happened. "John, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked just as confused as I felt, like he was torn between desire and guilt. "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me," he said, his voice thick with regret. We returned to the car in silence, the atmosphere tense and charged with unspoken emotions. The trip back was a complete contrast to the trip out. What started as a pleasant and innocent walk turned into a whirlwind of complex feelings. I felt betrayed, confused, and, in a way, guilty for not reacting immediately. When we finally arrived back in town, he parked the car in front of my house. "Please don't tell anyone about this," he pleaded, his voice soft and full of regret. I agreed, still stunned by what had happened. I got out of the car and walked into the house, feeling like I was in a strange, disturbing dream. That day changed everything. The image I had of my Uncle Joao, always loving and attentive, was tarnished by that moment of weakness. I spent the next few days trying to understand what that meant for our relationship. I avoided family gatherings for a while, trying to get my thoughts in order. That experience made me realize that sometimes the people we trust most can surprise us in the most unexpected ways. We reached a deserted stretch of road. The landscape around us was dominated by vast fields and gentle hills, creating a scene that seemed straight out of a painting. Joao stopped the car and suggested that we go out to stretch our legs. I agreed, thinking that some fresh air would be refreshing after being in the car for so long. As we got out of the vehicle, I felt the gentle breeze touch my face, and I closed my eyes for a moment, enjoying the tranquility of the place. Joao walked to a small hill nearby and called me to follow him. Upon reaching him, I could see the property he had mentioned before, a vast piece of land with incredible potential. He began talking about his ideas for the place, describing how he planned to build a welcoming home and create a haven for his family. It was then that I noticed a subtle change in the tone of his voice. He began to make bolder compliments, commenting on my appearance and how I had grown into a charming woman. "You're so beautiful, more so than I remembered," he said, his eyes shining in a way he'd never seen before. His compliments were different from before, filled with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The tension in the air was palpable. His every word seemed to carry an extra weight, an unspoken suggestion that hung between us. I felt my heart speed up and my mind started racing, trying to understand what was happening. He came closer, and before I could react, he kissed me. The kiss was intense and full of desire. I felt the heat of his body against mine, and for a moment I was paralyzed, unable to process the situation. My body reacted automatically, responding to his touch with a mix of surprise and curiosity. The taste of his lips was both familiar and strangely new, a contrast that left me even more confused. For an instant, the world around us seemed to disappear. The only thing that existed was that moment, that kiss filled with emotion and repressed desire. But reality quickly returned. I turned away from him, my heart pounding and my mind in a whirl. "John, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking with shock and confusion. He looked as distraught as I felt. "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me," he said, his voice full of regret and anguish. Guilt was written all over his face, and for a moment I saw the caring uncle I'd always known now struggling with his own conflicting emotions. The tension between us was almost unbearable. We walked back to the car in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The trip back was an emotional roller coaster. I felt betrayed and confused, trying to understand how our relationship had gotten to this point. Joao tried to apologize several times, but I was too stunned to respond. When we finally arrived back in town, he parked in front of my house. "Please don't tell anyone about this," he pleaded, his voice soft and full of guilt. I agreed, still stunned by what had happened. I got out of the car and walked into the house, feeling like I was in a strange, disturbing dream. That day changed everything. The image I had of my Uncle Joao, always loving and attentive, was tarnished by that moment of weakness. I spent the next few days trying to understand what that meant for our relationship. I avoided family gatherings for a while, trying to get my thoughts in order. That experience made me realize that sometimes the people we trust most can surprise us in the most unexpected ways. But most of all, it taught me that we must always be alert to signs and not allow trust to blind us to the true intentions of others. It was a painful but necessary lesson that irreversibly shaped the way I view relationships and trust. I was shocked and confused, but I couldn't push him away immediately. As his lips touched mine, a storm of emotions took over me. Part of me was intrigued by the intensity and heat of the moment. Physical proximity to Joao, someone who had always been a pillar of affection and support in my life, now had a new meaning that I didn't know how to deal with. My mind was in a whirlwind. I wanted to understand what was happening, but the mix of sensations paralyzed me. The kiss was both familiar and unfamiliar, a fine line between the comfort of a close relationship and the dangerous territory of unrequited desire. I felt the heat of his body and the touch of his hands, and for a moment I let myself be carried away by curiosity. But then reality began to set in. The initial shock gave way to a feeling of terror. I was there, vulnerable and confused, not knowing how to react. The affection and attention that Joao always gave me now seemed to have a different connotation, and I felt betrayed by someone I trusted blindly. My body reacted with a mixture of attraction and repulsion, and I didn't know what to do with these conflicting feelings. Finally, I found the strength within myself to walk away. "John, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking as I backed away from him. I needed space to breathe, to think. He looked equally distraught, his eyes filled with guilt and regret. "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me," he said, his voice low and wavering. He seemed genuinely sorry, but that didn't lessen the impact of what had just happened. The tension between us was almost palpable, an invisible barrier now rising between us. We walked back to the car in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The journey back was uncomfortable and full of uncertainty. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, trying to process what this meant for our relationship. The silence in the car was oppressive, and I felt trapped in a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't control. When we finally arrived back in town, he parked in front of my house. "Please don't tell anyone about this," he pleaded, his voice soft and full of guilt. I agreed, still stunned by what had happened. I got out of the car and walked into the house, feeling like I was in a strange, disturbing dream. That day changed everything. The image I had of my Uncle Joao, always loving and attentive, was tarnished by that moment of weakness. I spent the next few days trying to understand what that meant for our relationship. I avoided family gatherings for a while, trying to get my thoughts in order. That experience made me realize that sometimes the people we trust most can surprise us in the most unexpected ways. It was a painful but necessary lesson. I learned that we must always be aware of the signs and not allow confidence to blind us to the true intentions of others. The experience made me grow and become more cautious in my relationships, always remembering that even the closest people can hide desires and intentions that we would never imagine. Now, looking back, I see that moment was a turning point in my life. I learned to value my own intuition and not let emotional closeness blind me to reality. It's a lesson I carry with me to this day, a constant reminder that confidence must be balanced with caution and awareness. After a few minutes that felt like hours, I managed to push him away. It was a tremendous effort, as if I had to muster all my strength to create distance between us. My mind was in a whirl, struggling to understand what had just happened. I looked into Joao's eyes, still panting and confused, and told him that we needed to go back immediately. "John, this can't happen. We need to go back now." My voice was firm, but still trembling slightly. He nodded, visibly regretful, and walked back to the car. I followed him with a heavy heart and a head full of questions. We got into the car, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The journey back was silent and tense. The air inside the car felt thick, filled with unspoken words and conflicting feelings. John apologized several times, his voice a whisper of guilt and regret. "I'm sorry. I really don't know what happened. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you," he said, but I was lost in my own thoughts. As he spoke, my mind wandered, trying to make sense of the situation. How could that happen? Joao was always a safe haven for me, someone I trusted completely. Now that trust was broken, and I didn't know how to deal with it. The memories of the kiss still burned on my lips, a mixture of discomfort and a strange curiosity that I didn't want to admit. I looked out the window, trying to focus on the passing landscape, but everything seemed like a blur. My heart was racing, and I felt a lump in my throat that didn't seem to want to go away. With each apology from Joao, my confusion only increased. How could he cross that line? And why couldn't I push him away immediately? Finally, we arrived back in the city. Joao parked the car in front of my house, and for a moment we were silent, each trapped in our own thoughts. He turned to me, his eyes full of regret. "Please don't tell anyone about this. I never wanted to hurt you. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness," he begged. I just nodded, still speechless. I got out of the car and walked into the house, feeling like I was in a strange, disturbing dream. I went up the stairs to my room and threw myself on the bed, looking at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. Joel's words echoed in my mind, mixed with my own conflicting emotions. In the days that followed, I avoided any contact with Joel. Family gatherings became a challenge, and I made up excuses not to attend. My mind was a jumble of feelings: betrayal, confusion, a strange sense of guilt. How could I face Joel again, knowing what had happened? I knew I needed time to understand my own feelings. The image I had of Joel, always caring and attentive, was now tarnished. That moment of weakness changed everything, and I didn't know how or if our relationship could be repaired. The experience taught me a painful lesson about trust and vulnerability. I realized that sometimes the people we trust most can surprise us in the most unexpected and painful ways. It was a difficult but necessary lesson that shaped the way I view relationships and trust from then on. Over time, I began to heal, process what happened, and understand that despite the pain, I needed to move on. Our relationship would never be the same, but I learned to value my own intuition and the importance of setting clear boundaries, even with those we love and trust. When we arrived back in town, he insisted that I not tell anyone. There was desperation in his voice, a palpable fear that the truth would come out and destroy not only his image, but also the relationship he had with his entire family. I promised I wouldn't do it, not for him, but because I didn't know how to deal with what had happened. I was still processing everything, and the last thing I wanted was to face questions or judgment. That experience completely changed my perception of him and myself. Joel, the uncle who had always been a pillar of support and affection, was now a complex and confusing figure in my mind. I couldn't reconcile the man who carried me on his shoulders when I was little with the man who had kissed me with so much intensity and desire. Over the next few days, the confusion and pain were almost unbearable. I avoided meeting him at family gatherings, making up excuses not to attend. When I couldn't avoid it, I did my best to keep my distance, always finding a reason to be in another room or involved in some activity that would keep me away from him. Each chance encounter was a painful reminder of that day, and I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of loss. My behavior did not go unnoticed by my family. My mother asked me several times if something was wrong, but I just said I was busy with work or tired. I didn't want to share what had happened. The shame and guilt were overwhelming. Why didn't I push him away immediately? Why did I let that happen? I started to question my own identity and my feelings. Before, I had a clear and confident vision of who I was and what I wanted in life. Now, everything seemed hazy. Every happy memory with Joel was tarnished, and I felt lost, not knowing who to trust or how to move forward. Therapy was an unexpected relief. After weeks of confusion and pain, I decided to seek professional help. Talking about what happened, even anonymously, gave me a new perspective. I learned that it wasn't my fault, that John's actions reflected his own problems and not something I did or caused. I slowly started to rebuild my confidence and find ways to cope. Avoiding John at family gatherings became second nature. I arrived late and left early, ensuring our encounters were kept to a minimum. My family began to notice the distance between us, but no one asked direct questions. It was as if everyone knew something was wrong, but preferred not to confront the truth. And I, for now, was content to maintain that facade. The experience transformed me in ways I never could have anticipated. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my intuition more, and to set clear limits, even with those I love. It was a painful but necessary lesson that made me grow and become a stronger and more resilient person. Looking back is still painful, but I also see how that event shaped me. Today, I am more aware of who I am and what I deserve. And despite everything, I found a way to forgive myself, even if I can never fully forgive Joelle. Life moved on, and so did I, wiser and stronger than before. Years later, looking back, I realized that incident taught me a lot about boundaries and trust. The memory of that day, although painful, has become a crucial part of my personal journey. I never revealed to anyone what happened that afternoon, not even my closest friends or family. Keeping this secret was a heavy burden, but also a source of learning and growth. The experience made me stronger and more aware of my own vulnerabilities. Before that day, I had never questioned the nature of my closest relationships. Joelle has always been a figure of trust, a safe haven amid the turmoil of life. However, his betrayal forced me to reevaluate how I established and maintained my emotional and physical boundaries. I remember a specific moment a few years later when I was at a family party. Joelle was there as always, but something in me had changed. I felt a new inner strength, a clarity about who I was and what I deserved. He tried to get closer, perhaps seeking a silent reconciliation, but this time I was ready. I maintained a respectful and firm distance, clearly signaling that our relationship had changed irrevocably. This incident also taught me the importance of respecting my own limits. I learned to say no and establish healthy barriers, not just with Joelle, but in all my relationships. This new attitude was reflected in several areas of my life. At work, I started to assert myself more, demanding respect and recognition for my efforts. In personal relationships, I began to value my own voice and ensure that my needs were met. As the years passed, the pain of that afternoon began to dissipate, giving way to a sense of resilience and self-acceptance. I understood that it wasn't my fault, that I hadn't caused that situation. Joelle had crossed a line, and my reaction, although delayed, was a reflection of my growth and self-discovery. Once, during a therapy session, my therapist asked me how I had dealt with the feeling of betrayal. I thought for a moment and replied, "I learned to forgive myself." It was a moment of epiphany. I realized that for a long time I had been carrying an unnecessary weight of guilt and shame, but that moment allowed me to see that I had done the best I could in a complicated and unexpected situation. From this revelation, I began to see the incident in a new light. Instead of a constant shadow in my life, it became a starting point for my transformation. I was able to build a life where my voice and limits were respected. I created a safe space for myself where I could grow and flourish without fear of being silenced or invaded. Today, when I look back, I see that afternoon not just as a moment of pain, but as a catalyst for my growth. If the experience shaped me, teaching me the importance of trusting my own intuition and setting clear boundaries. I learned to value my own dignity and demand respect in all areas of my life. I have never revealed to anyone what happened that afternoon, and perhaps I never will. But the lesson I took away from this experience is something I carry with me every day. I am stronger, wiser, and more aware of my own vulnerabilities and the importance of respecting my own limits. And for that, I am grateful, even if the journey has been painful. This story of betrayal and recovery is a constant reminder that no matter how difficult a situation is, there is always an opportunity for growth and transformation. And most of all, it's a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of never letting a negative experience define who we are or who we can become.